Hello everyone, I'm Stefan, and welcome back to another episode of A Manic Odyssey. We've got lots to discuss today because today we are laying some groundwork for how to best understand someone with borderline personality disorder. The hope is you walk away with a better understanding of the diagnosis and how to spot potential traits as strengths and others as areas with room for growth. So, let's jump right into the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. First off, BPD is one of 10 personality disorders in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and ICD, Internal Classification of Diseases. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by intense shifts in mood within a relatively short period of time, amongst other factors I'll touch on in a second. People with BPD will often be misdiagnosed as having bipolar 1 or 2, but there's a difference. The main difference is that borderline is a personality disorder and bipolar is a mood disorder, like depression. With bipolar 1 or 2, clinicians look for episodes of mania that can last anywhere between 4 and 7 days, maybe more. These are days in a row of huge, expansive, excitable, high moods, and when it reaches its end, the low can be dangerously debilitating. If the mood fluctuation and the high highs and low lows are all in one day or even 1 hour, then it's more likely the individual has BPD over bipolar or some other comorbid disorder. When I talk about the mental health care one needs and one receives when diagnosed with BPD, it's helpful to keep in mind that, just like all institutions, the level of care exists on a large spectrum. That mental health care spectrum is based on experience, worldview, and values. That can mean some clinicians refuse to work with a borderline, while others actively seek them out to help. So, when it comes to borderline personality diagnosis and treatment, the spectrum of care remains vast. For example, what that could look like is one clinician searching super close for one aspect of the borderline, while another may think to look elsewhere. And that is because clinicians often disagree over the presentation of certain traits. But a real challenging aspect of the diagnosis is the stigma associated with it. I once had a doctor question the diagnosis to my face while I was getting routine blood work done. His doubt made me chuckle because it was a snap judgment based on a minute or so long interaction. The point is, in this spectrum of care, you may encounter helpful and thoughtful clinicians, and you may unfortunately bump into predatory clinicians looking only to keep retention high and overhead low, regardless of your needs. If you have a stigmatized diagnosis, and you're trying to get the help you need, and people are unwilling to give you that help despite it being their job, you are not the problem. The professionals and people who do not do the work or take the time to look into how to best support you after you ask for help are the ones who need a perspective shift and values audit. The clinicians who avoid the borderline do so because stories of the intense, consistent work required to care for the individual get passed around the psychological and psychiatric communities like a note passed around in an 8th grade classroom. It's also not enough to have the borderline talk about how their emotions are affecting their relationships. Talk therapy is not an effective tool for the borderline by itself. Thus, as you can imagine, discovering you have borderline personality disorder is already a mixed bag at best. To then learn that some professionals in the field that are supposed to help you typically steer clear of you leaves a less than great taste in my mouth. So, to all the clinicians out there who actively avoid the tough diagnosis, please think about it like this. We are walking around with a gas leak in our minds, and the world is overwhelmingly full of lit matches. You have the ability to help close that leak, and in so doing, have the potential to stop explosions and their ripple effect for countless. We need your help, so please consider stepping up and into spaces where the tough cases need you. Okay, now why does the borderline need certain care, and why do certain therapies not work as effectively as others? Well, let's now look at the 9 traits that can make up the borderline personality disorder, and how these traits can present. As you will see, there are a lot of overlapping moving pieces, which could not all be caught by one wide net in talk therapy, and many others. Number 1, fear of abandonment. This is the most common and quickly recognizable trait of BPD, though this fear can present in uncommon ways too. In my close relationships, fear of abandonment presents as worry about doing something which could make the friend want to stop being friends with me. In its more unhelpful manifestations, I can lose sight of the facts, like, this friend has loved me through worse than this, and get caught up in a series of catastrophic worst-case scenarios. As I will continue to say, I have incredible friends, so it's pretty easy for me to check the facts and speak to the anxiety in ways that will quell the fear of abandonment in that context. In romantic relationships, it is presented by leaving first. The fear and pain of someone I am romantically attracted to leaving me was a pain I literally could not fathom. So I'd find ways to sabotage the relationship and exit before, in my mind, they could exit first. Even worse though, once I did exit, the fear transformed into guilt, shame, and regret, thus reinforcing a mental cycle of overvaluation and apathy or undervaluation. The big thing is, the abandonment may not even exist. It may be perceived. Like if someone shows up late, a neurotypical person who can think more abstractly and dialectically might think the person hit traffic or something innocuous. The borderline may jump to a belief like, makes sense, I am not worth showing up on time for anyway, who cares, they'll probably not show up, I wouldn't. Oftentimes, the preparation for real or perceived abandonment becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as the borderline wears the person down with actions trying to thwart something that may not even be there. But damn, does it sure feel like it really is. Fear of abandonment sucks. Number 2, unstable and really intense interpersonal relationships. This one feeds in quite nicely to what I just said about how fear of abandonment can present differently for different people. My mind is constantly moving at a speed that would make most people ill. But my personality, my nature, is very friendly. I like people. I like the quote, the quickest way to get rid of an enemy is to make him a friend. I have been incredibly lucky, like beyond lucky, to have the friends I've had over the years. I can think of multiple occasions where I exploded, lost my temper, felt like I lost my mind, raged, or rage quit, or spewed hurtful words, and in my life, I'm lucky to have had friends who were willing to forgive me and come back to our friendship stronger than before. But this is not that common. Usually what happens is that borderlines are so intense, their moods are so variable, that when an interpersonal conflict happens, there's already so much internal turmoil, and there's no charge to the battery for conflict outside the self to be safely and reasonably expressed. So a great many borderlines lose a lot of friends and become self-isolated, which only makes everything absolutely worse. In fact, according to one study titled Personality and Attachment in the Homeless, a systematic review in the United States last year, BPD was the most common personality disorder occurring in 45% of the past year homelessness participants and in 11% of the non-past year homelessness participants. So maybe next time you are trying to avoid eye contact with a houseless person who is pacing up and down the street, keep in mind some of us are only 1 or 2 friendships away from social isolation, and this mental illness feeds off of that isolation. Acknowledging someone's humanity can go a long way. I can say there is a high chance they are experiencing a level of mental suffering reserved for the most horrific stories of hell. Number 3, identity disturbance. No lie, this one is tough for me to talk about. Identity disturbance means I have often felt, and many borderlines often feel, like I have no idea who I am. When I was a Christian, this identity disturbance presented differently. Christianity is such an intensely wide spectrum that it's hard to pin down one specific aspect of the religion as it pertains to experiencing identity disturbances. I know the Christianity I grew up believing in, well into my 20s, has some pretty rigid moral boxes, which either get checked or don't. The religion was unintentionally promoting splitting within me, a term used to describe when someone starts speaking and thinking in black and white language, either or instead of both and. It was really painful to try and find identity while suppressing so much of my own. So, terrified of hell and being perceived as a sinner, I clung to the clearest and strongest identity markers I could, and white-knuckled them for a long time. Thus, as a Christian boy, I could at least be those two things, Christian and male. But within that model, the identity disturbance reared its head in ways unique to that religious experience. So you can see how a kid like me ran into trouble with some of the bigger, tougher questions that being in a religion brings up. A lot of the questions that come up in religion require, at least in part, a dialectical approach. In the stories of the Bible, God is often two things at once, vengeful and merciful, sad and apathetic, strong and weak, here and gone. Thus, I would try to grasp dialectical concepts, and in so doing, would lose parts of myself in the process, which cultivated a loop of anxiety to my every waking moment. However, and I'll maybe go into deeper detail about this another time, when I left that religion, when I removed those two identity markers and the many others I developed and felt connected to over time, it was one of the most painful and miserable times of my life. That was all pre-diagnosis, and I'm compassionate to myself in hindsight, and it was awful, and I did a lot of awful things to try and soothe the emotional pain that oozed out of that. But do you know what got me through it and kept me alive? My close friendships. Do not underestimate the power and impact of the people you surround yourself with. Who you have in your corner may save your life. It definitely saves mine. Number 4, impulsivity. You know, it's interesting because this word impulsive in our culture almost has a playful tone to it. Like we'll think of the impulsive spender, eater, seer of movies, whatever fairly benign spin we put on it. But if you're compulsively spending your entire paycheck before you pay rent, if you eat to the point of throwing up or until your stomach hurts, if you go to see a movie instead of meeting your friend for lunch like you said you would, impulsivity becomes a lot more nefarious and destructive. The danger lies in not thinking about consequences. When I was at my most impulsive and least inhibited, my thoughts raced 1,000,000,000 miles per hour, bombarding me with emotional distress. So that little act of impulse distracted and soothed my burning mind. Of course, the soothing is short and limited. But that doesn't mean the consequences won't be severe. So much of my impulsivity and the impulsive tendencies of the borderline are mood dependent. If I'm not in touch with my body, my mood, and my mind, then there's a greater risk of using impulsivity as a tool instead of the myriad of other healthier tools in my toolbox. Number 5, recurrent suicidal behavior or suicidal thoughts. This trait alone is heavy enough. People with BPD have a relatively high rate of suicide attempts. This dangerous trait can mix with the fear of abandonment in some very toxic ways. Someone with BPD may hurt themselves as a reaction to someone threatening to leave. It's like, oh, you think you're going to leave? Well, then I'm going to hurt myself or worse. Or it could present as someone with BPD calling someone else and telling them they are currently hurting themselves. Any reasonable and compassionate person will respond by showing up, and thus the fear of abandonment is quelled momentarily. But you can see how this can quickly become dangerously cyclical. The biggest danger happens when someone with BPD is using self-harm as a coping method that then accidentally goes too far. I don't need to go into detail, you can imagine. Suicidal thoughts are so pernicious they dig into your brain like ticks, and it becomes an itch you believe you need to scratch. It's also very difficult to explain the feeling to people who do not experience it, or have not experienced it. Life is worth living, but if there's anyone who can convince you it's not, it's you. Which is why having a healthy, supportive community can literally save your life. Having other voices in your head as support can literally save your life. No person is an island. As for me and my thoughts, I'm currently on medication that for now is helping slow them down, especially my suicidal ideation. It's not gone, but where I am today means I can hear the thought and let it go by, instead of grabbing hold and perseverating on it. It doesn't always work, and luckily, I have other ways to cope with it that I'm excited to share with you once we dive into DBT. Number 6, affective instability. This is a fluty-tooty way of just saying a person with BPD's moods are all over the place. My mood can shift drastically within an hour, like those whistles you got as a kid that make the sound as they tip one way or the other. It's like our emotional nerve endings are antennas set to the highest frequency, all the time. And if you don't have the tools to manage and cope with that feeling, your mood moves all around like a pinball in a never-ending machine. I still experience this, and I'm grateful to now have the tools to ride the urge, ride the wave of the emotion, instead of drowning in it or trying to fight against it. Number 7, chronic feeling of emptiness inside. It makes me laugh, and I think my sense of humor is coming from the absurdity of this description. Like, what the f does that even equate to in reality? The best way I can describe it is that it feels like my mind constantly feels thirst without relief. My mind feels restless and thirsty for something to give me a feeling of wholeness. It's like I'm walking down an apple orchard and plucking the apples that give me meaning, not realizing there's a big old hole in the bucket. This then inspires panic, because just like how we need water in real life, my mind is telling me if we don't get water, if we don't get something to fill this void, we may die. It's a horrible, horrible feeling. Also, I hope you're starting to see how these traits could interact with each other. If I'm looking for something to end that emptiness, and I don't have tools to keep my impulsivity in check, then I may do something dangerous, damaging, or reckless just to avoid that empty feeling. Looking back now, I worked really hard to cultivate an identity growing up with my Christian beliefs. I genuinely believed I was faulty, like I was just defective, because so many people around me kept finding their identity in Jesus Christ or some variation of a Jesus Christ, and I would try and do everything I could to internalize that reality and make it my own. But time and time again, I would literally be on my knees as a child, crying because I thought the Holy Spirit, Jesus, and God had literally left me because that was the level of chronic emptiness I felt inside. To quote a childhood Christian banger, it's a big, big house with nothing inside. Number 8, strong shows of anger. Anger. This one I understand. The borderline will often have inappropriate and intense shows of anger. When frustrating things, even little things, happen, we may blow up. We may throw things, scream, break things, and it is so quick, abrupt, and intense, it frightens anyone who is around. People will often describe living with someone with borderline as walking on eggshells because the last thing they want to do is set them off and deal with their rage. We have really thin skin that has to be intentionally, through consistent therapeutic effort, grown thicker. Without the tools and skills to help mediate that anger, an explosion is inevitable, and the damage is done, which will lead to the equally inevitable feelings that follow. I can say my most intense instances of self-harm came on the heels of an explosive and angry outburst. The body can only exert so much, and when a borderline is raging, their entire body is involved. So in those instances, as soon as I come down, which I always do, eventually, even if it takes days, the feelings that follow can be devastating. I'll feel regret, shame, embarrassment, stupid, small, and my fervor for life diminishes to nothing, which is of course fertile ground for unhelpful, dangerous thoughts to make their way into the forefront of my mind. A painful aspect of this outburst cycle is what happens to the people closest to us. They will often blame themselves for the outburst, trying to calculate and replay what happened so it won't happen again. And before they know it, the whole ground is covered in eggshells. Number 9. Transient stress-induced paranoid ideation and other psychotic symptomatology. A very fancy way to say under stress, particularly intense stress, for a period of time, we may experience frankly paranoid symptoms. That could look like believing others are out to get me, harm me, conspiring against me, or even hearing voices. The worst part is, if a borderline is seen at this particular point, it can look delusional and psychotic, which will more likely lead to a misdiagnosis. We can sometimes experience symptoms of disassociation, and in those cases, we may break off from reality. That is why it can take sincere, intense, continuous assessment with a clinician who has experience to make an accurate diagnosis. Okay, that was a lot of information, and if you feel like, oh crap, that describes me, or these are horrible traits, let's practice a little bit of dialectical thinking, where two things which seem opposite can coexist at once. We'll deep dive into this in a different video to come. Let's reframe BPD. Here are some positives about living with borderline personality disorder. For starters, borderlines tend to have a higher level of empathy than others. We're often hypersensitive to our surroundings, especially to what other people are thinking about us. In times of suffering and unhealth, this increased sensitivity can lead to dysfunction in relationships, clouding communication abilities, and disturbing the relationship and the longevity of the relationship. But in health, this can mean the borderline really can feel and know what the other person is going through, oftentimes before the other person notices. We may not always be right when guessing how the other person is feeling, but we very well may be the first person to ask how the other person is doing or feeling, or why they might be upset. Borderlines can be very attentive to how you're feeling, and since our inner pain is palpable and we don't want the people we care about to feel any semblance of that pain, we can prioritize making sure you feel cared for and heard. Next is flexibility. Because people like me with BPD can experience constant reality and identity shifts, we often don't know who we are or what we want to do, often jumping from hobby to hobby, job to job, not quite sure what is going to fit. In its darker forms, this can lead to really destructive instability. But in a milder presentation of this trait, you could see how having someone in your life who's up for new stuff, down to try something new even though they've not done it, can be a great friend to have, because they're not as rigid. You want to go skydiving and no one else will go with you? I'm down. You've picked up a new hobby and want someone to try it with you. Sounds exciting. Life is full of new and awesome experiences, and having someone with BPD in your life to explore those experiences with can be a real asset. Okay, on to decision making. Have you ever been in a group and no one can decide on where to go to dinner? Have you ever been given a deadline to make an important business decision and cannot afford to be bogged down by analysis paralysis? Having a borderline in your group or on your team can be a really great thing. Often, borderlines are bolder in decision making. Of course, in unhealth, impulsive decision making can be disastrous. But when talking about the positive side of this trait, think about how scary risk-taking, even with something as mundane as which place we eat, can be at times. A borderline can take risks that could lead to good and even great outcomes. In health, this can look like really healthy risk-taking, because making a decision in a pinch or under pressure may be less impactful because the borderline is bolder. My best friend often referred to me as the Kool-Aid man, because while he and others cautiously opened doors to new experiences, weighing the pros and cons, I would smash through the wall no matter what was on the other side, and then people could walk in through a giant hole in the wall, instead of entering through the front door. As you can imagine, the results were a mixed bag. I'd say mostly good, though these days I tend to use the door a lot more. The reason I added these positive reframes is because we talk about personality disorders as a lifelong struggle. The endless hill with no peak, no view, no relief in sight. But some of these traits, as we just saw, can have positive parts of their build too. And keeping these positives at the forefront of one's mind can really help us stay motivated through therapy. Now, you may be thinking, hey, that sounds like blah, blah, blah. They must be borderline. Stop. Unless you're a clinician with extensive experience diagnosing people with personality disorders, you do not make a diagnosis. However, if you suspect someone close to you may fall into this label, the best thing you can do is to gently encourage them to seek treatment. In order to be diagnosed with BPD, you need to show at least 5 symptoms out of the 9. And keep in mind, diagnosing is a tool to drive treatment. It is not a label, it is not your complete identity, it is a tool to help you. My life is only better and getting better because finally, for the first time, someone gave me a flashlight that actually works. I was stumbling around in the dark, miserable, looking for answers everywhere. And thanks to this accurate diagnosis, I can finally start living life with a clear sense of direction. It's like I'm starting over with new eyes, new hands, new everything. Because now that I know how I experience the world around me, I can learn to experience it in ways that promote life, joy, purpose, happiness, and whatever else I decide. The diagnosis is not the end-all be-all. It is not the landing pad. It's the jumping-off point. Now that you have a wider grasp on the traits which can make up borderline personality disorder, we'll begin to take a look at the evidence-based treatment best suited to support and help the borderline thrive. Next episode, we'll begin our dive into dialectical behavior therapy. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time on A Manic Odyssey.